One of the true greats arrives on Super NES Works Episode 16. Every once in a while, a survey of a classic video game system brings you to a wholly unique creation, a game like none other before it or after it. Even more rarely, such a singular work even turns out to be good. And here we have one of those rare few, ActRaiser. After a strong launch, the Super NES's library tapered off somewhat in terms of quality. Certainly we've seen some quality games outside of Nintendo's launch quartet of F-Zero, Super Mario World, Pilot Wings, and SimCity, but nothing that quite matched the excellence and creativity we saw in the day one first-party material. ActRaiser, however, stands toe-to-toe with the best Nintendo had to offer. It's not a perfect creation by any means, but all of its different parts add up to something quite unlike any other work for the system. Ironically, on its surface, ActRaiser could be the most generic first-year Super NES release imaginable. It's yet another god game, in which you manage the growth of a civilization from an omnipotent, eye-in-the-sky point of view, and at the same time it's a deliberate and challenging platform action game of the type we'll see shortly with Super Ghouls and Ghosts and Super CASTLEVANIA 4. It's in the confluence of these genres that ActRaiser achieves its distinction. Yeah, we'll see no shortage of god sims and platformers on the Super NES, but one that says, why not both? Well, even ActRaiser's own sequel didn't do that. Let's descend to Earth and see what, precisely, makes this game so special. After a short preamble in which you give your character a name and hear a little story exposition from an angel, ActRaiser thrusts you immediately into the fray. The game's first sequence plays out as pure action, which might give you the impression that ActRaiser amounts to a twitchy hack and slash, in the Castlevania and Rastan Saga vein. It is, of course, but it also isn't. Still, this makes for a compelling kickoff. You ultimately spend a lot less time in the action portions of ActRaiser than you do in the sim mode, but the game begins and ends with combat sequences. As a platformer, ActRaiser is decent, if not amazing. Again, it feels very much like a Rastan clone. You control a bulky armored warrior who wields a broadsword. He moves slowly and swings his blade in a very deliberate arc. While your avatar, here known simply as the Master, moves somewhat clumsily, he's not graceless. You have a lot of aerial control over your hero, which comes in handy for some of the more advanced platforming that crops up later. Really though, ActRaiser's action sequences require a combination of platform design instincts and memorization. For the most part, its platforming portions demonstrate the design discipline you've come to expect from the better grade of Japanese-developed action games. Unlike American and European platformers of the era, ActRaiser pairs its rigid but reliable controls with level design that makes sense and feels fair. Enemy placement rarely shows up at random. You can usually predict where some sort of hazard will attempt to cause you to take a tumble, and the more cruel sequences almost always have a health recovery item as a chaser. ActRaiser's combat isn't nearly as punishing as Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Not only does the Master move with more limberness and fight fewer infinitely spawning monsters than poor Arthur, he also has a stout health bar to allow him to shake off multiple mistakes. While you definitely need to get a handle on the action mechanics here, ActRaiser has enough forgiveness baked into its design that you can eventually get through even the roughest patch with persistence. Still, there are a few strange design choices to be found here. The most frustrating of these has to do with the Master's magic skills and the strange persistence of his mana reserves. Before entering an action sequence, you can outfit the Master with one of several different magic spells. These vary wildly in value. Once you acquire Magical Stardust, there's no reason not to just leave that permanently bound to your spell slot, since it's basically an instant win button against most bosses. But you can only use spells a limited number of times, based on the spell charges you've earned along the way. You only have a handful at the beginning, but eventually can boost your output enough to be able to use magic liberally against all the foes in the final boss rush. The thing is though, spell charges work only once per action sequence. If you die, they don't recharge for your next life. It's a small detail, but it feels very odd and somewhat unfriendly, especially in the early going when the Master is fragile, low on resources, but still has to fight some tough bosses. Then again, the trick to pretty much every boss is just to find an exploit. With some enemies, combat amounts to a button-mashing race to zero health, while others can be destroyed almost instantly with a correct magic spell. Even the most vexing foes, like the Manticore you have to fight in order to enter the realm of Bloodpool, turn out to have a cheap, easy win gimmick. The Manticore leaps back and forth across a pair of 3-tier platforms, blasting fire across the screen and actively avoiding coming into close range of the Master's sword. But if you stand on the second platform, you can just cheese the fight by occasionally leaping flames and taking a swing at the Manticore when he leaps near. Oh well. The action isn't precisely inspired in places, but it also doesn't feel wildly lopsided against the player, which means that people who come to ActRaiser for the role-playing and simulation elements don't have to worry too much about hitting a wall that brings their adventure to a permanent halt. And there is a lot to like about the action. The game's 12 action stages all have their own distinct setting and personality, from forests to buried pyramids to ice tundra. Some stages involve dangerous platforming over vast pits of magno pools, while others emphasize pure combat. Despite their brevity and linearity, the combat levels contain a fair few secrets ranging from health pickups to temporary bonus spell charges to extra points. Of course, ActRaiser isn't really the kind of game you play in pursuit of a high score, but those points do matter. They feed into the game's second aspect, the simulation. Yeah, ActRaiser is another god sim for Super NES. Indeed, you'll spend most of the game's playtime in this mode, attempting to bring civilization to 6 realms across the world. Now, if you come to ActRaiser expecting a deep, meaty simulation experience like SimCity or even Populous, you're going to leave disappointed. The god mode here is a slight, lightweight, and extremely limited experience. But I think that speaks to one of ActRaiser's core strengths. Populous was a computer game that happened to show up on Super NES, warts and all. And while Nintendo tweaked SimCity to be more console-friendly than the PC original, it still felt a little dense and unwieldy in places. I mean, the SimCity manual has an index in the back. ActRaiser's sim portion, on the other hand, plays like one built from the ground up for consoles. We'll see a similar dichotomy soon for RPGs, with Final Fantasy II, a game that plays radically different from the PC RPG Draken. The God mode in ActRaiser incorporates shoot-'em-up and real-time strategy elements. It revolves around a central narrative, and it's even broken into 6 stages, set on predefined scenery. There's really a very limited amount of stuff to do in ActRaiser's simulations, and every playthrough more or less works out the same, to the point that there's even an optimal strategy to help players maximize their population and therefore their score. In other words, this ain't exactly Will Wright, but it works and it's engrossing. Once you enter a new region, you use divine magic to send 2 people, a man and a woman, down to settle in the area. They take up residence in the temple, the heart of their new civilization, which always appears on the same plot of land in every playthrough. Once your settlers are there and have offered up their initial prayers, you begin cultivating the land for them. You can use divine intervention to clear-cut scrubby ground, dry up swampy patches, and even shake away threats with earthquakes or wind. From there, you use a cursor to direct your people's growth. With each round of action, they'll cultivate one new plot of land toward their goal, and wrap up their efforts for that round by laying down some rough development to the square beyond that. As your villages grow in size and sophistication, your people level up and can begin making sturdier buildings that house more citizens. Your goal is to maximize your population in each region, which involves a lot of passively sitting around waiting for the timer to count down, so your townfolk will pop out more babies and construct more homes. There's a lot of watching the computer go through its routine here, especially once you hit max civilization level for an area, and hit it with an earthquake to clear out the low-value huts in favor of more advanced buildings. Yes, ActRaiser posits that God is a slumlord. This all comes late in each cycle though. At the outset of a new region, ActRaiser is much less of a passive experience and far more stressful. When you first establish a population in a new region, the land is dotted with the lairs of demons. These monsters will fly around your kingdom, attempting to hassle both you, or rather your angelic avatar who serves as a sort of cursor for the sim mode, and your mortal children. Luckily for you, ActRaiser has the sort of vague outsider's view of Christian imagery that you often get in Japanese media, which means your little angel pal is basically Battle Cupid. As you fly around, you can fire cute little arrows at monsters to destroy them. This is not exactly biblical canon, but it keeps you on your toes. You can't simply issue orders to your followers, and you have to worry about the demons that fly through the air. Some demons abduct citizens, reducing your population, while others target the angel. Later, once your people uncover the secret of cultivating fields, you have to worry about demons setting fire to them. And towards the end of the quest, as you begin to develop lands near the villain's lair in Deathheim, you even have to take on massive skull demons that can generate earthquakes. Ultimately, the way to deal with demons is to seal their lairs. You can do this in one of 2 ways. First, you can kill every single demon in a given lair. There's a finite number within each one, but usually that number is somewhere in the upper hundreds, so that's kind of a tedious option. A much better approach is to direct your civilization towards a lair. Once civic development arrives at a demon generator, your citizens will seal it themselves, with a pair of priests invoking magic spells that vanquish evil once and for all. As you clear away the demon's lairs, your people will uncover treasures and other items that they then offer up to the master as an annual tribute, and this ties everything together. The idea of marrying an action platformer and a god sim into a single game seems a strange concept on its surface. The two formats have wildly different styles, themes, objectives, and goals, yet somehow ActRaiser makes it work. While the bulk of the game plays out through the simulation mode, the combat stages serve as bookends of sorts for your time in each region. In order to seed a new land with settlers, you have to defeat a sort of demonic gatekeeper and claim its turf. Once you've defeated a boss, you can set up shop in its old haunts and begin the process of transforming that region into a habitable space. The premise behind ActRaiser is that you, the master, are basically the Yahweh of the Old Testament. Sadly, the demon Tanzra, who straight up is called Satan in the Japanese version, gained the upper hand long ago and has ruled the earth for ages. Now, the master has awakened and aims to reclaim the world from Tanzra. So that's why each new settlement begins with a battle against a demon boss. It's essentially the ruler of that territory. Your performance in both combat and simulation modes affect the master's growth. With each experience level you gain, you restore some of the master's former strength. Both simulation population count and your combat score tally feed into your experience levels, so strong performance in each mode is essential to hitting level 17 and restoring the master's full original glory. ActRaiser works as more than an action game due to the way the sim mode and action portions feed into one another. Some of the offerings your citizens deliver empower your angelic avatar. For example, you can occasionally get a hold of a super arrow capable of shredding even the toughest demons like tissue paper, but just as often, an offering will transfer over to your combat avatar. Usually these take the form of extra spells and extra spell charges, and the levels you earn as your population rises buff your health meter, taking the master from delicate to durable over the course of his quest. Each land has a second combat stage that has to be confronted once you've reached a certain point in cultivating that area. You can actually strike out to new regions before completing a current land. The only limitation on venturing into a new territory is your combat avatar's level. Indeed, in some cases you'll actually need to leave one region in progress and venture into another to unlock some crucial cultural skills. Each of your peoples develops a unique talent as their civilization advances, and these need to be cross-pollinated throughout different societies in order to fully develop the world. So you need Fillmore's development of bridge making in order to properly spread across the rivers that divide Bloodpool. Aitos's sheep fleece offers the warmth the people of Northwall need in order to populate that frigid land. You need Cassandra's harmonious music to bring peace to Bloodpool. The herb grown in Marana can cure a plague in Cassandra, and so forth. In other words, ActRaiser has an interlocking, overlapping design akin to a console RPG rather than a traditional simulation. This results in a brief and linear game, but one with a brilliant sense of progression that transplants the one-more-turn vibe of a great sim like Civilization into an off-kilter exercise in genre-busting. The back-and-forth nature of the critical path and the semi-open nature of establishing new lands goes a long way toward mitigating the fact that this is a simulation RPG that demands a certain degree of twitch skill. If one region's platforming sequences prove too taxing, you can always shift gears by heading to a different region and building up some experience and health over there before returning to take another attempt at clearing that one sticking point. But what really ties the game together is the way its story buoys the premise. The fact that ActRaiser manages to dabble in both turn-based genres and pure action so effectively shouldn't come as a total surprise given its pedigree. This was the first creation by a studio called Quintet, who appeared to have a close relationship with the RPG powerhouse that was Enix. Quintet itself was established by a group of former Nihon Falcom employees. Two of the studio's founding members, Masaya Hashimoto and Tomoyoshi Miyazaki, were key designers for the original Ys. Quintet's second Super NES release, Soul Blazer, would hew closely to the overhead action RPG design of Ys. Still, you can see the influence of Falcom's work here, too. ActRaiser shares a lot in common with many of the Dragon Slayer sequels, such as Sorcerian and Xanadu. At the same time, I don't doubt that publisher Enix's influence can be seen in the fact that ActRaiser is incredibly streamlined and accessible. The game shares a lot in common with Enix's big-ticket franchise, Dragon Quest. Like Dragon Quest, the game gives players an adventurous sandbox to dabble in that feels a lot bigger and more open than it actually is. Your skills, general character growth, and primary path through the narrative don't really offer all that much room to stray and explore, but they all feel expansive. ActRaiser manages that rare trick of creating the impression of a grand-scale epic adventure while in practice giving players a fairly guided experience whose limits don't really become apparent until a second playthrough. And as with the Dragon Quest titles that would appear over the following decade, ActRaiser's plot largely advances through self-contained story vignettes that help to humanize the plot and create empathy for the tiny computer people you deal with. That's an especially critical feat here, thanks to the detached nature of the God Sim genre. While the combat sequences are very much a boots-on-the-ground affair, as the master manifests on Earth by possessing a statue that carries a big stick with which to beat down Tanzra and his minions, the sim sequences take place at a great remove, with your people and their homes depicted in abstract terms. The writing here, which arguably is the first truly great Japanese to English localization ever committed to ROM, explores topics that would become mainstays of Quintet's work. What is the nature of mortality, and the obligation of a deity? It's not as heavy as all of that up front, though. ActRaiser approaches its philosophical moments with a light touch that would be lost in later Quintet titles, leaving much of its weightier material for the player to infer from subtext. The game's scenario writer does a lot of the moment-to-moment world building by creating individual characters within each civilization. Some of this breaks the show-don't-tell rule of writing, but it still works. For example, you eventually learn that one of the 2 original settlers in one region died while fighting demons. His widow offers a memorial and tribute to her lost husband's memory, and from that point forward you see only a single supplicant in that land's temples when you listen to the people's prayers. The story hooks often play out through game mechanics. When a dying man asks to pass away while covered in the master's tears, you grant his wish by summoning rain. Some of these tiny dramas play out through tiny little in-game plays. You can watch explorers wander around a remote island, for example. And then there's Teddy. Teddy's story perfectly sums up everything that makes ActRaiser so charming. Early on in your cultivation of Bloodpool, your supplicants express concern about their son Teddy, whose personality they fear will get him into trouble. Throughout your time in Bloodpool, you're given little updates about Teddy, and indeed, eventually he wanders off away from home, getting lost along a distant lakeshore. His parents ask you to grant him the divine miracle of food to keep him from starving as he's gone astray in the wilderness. When you gift a miraculous loaf of bread to the tiny little 7-pixel tall person wandering on his own, Teddy will return home and help unlock the secret of destroying the final demon's lair in the region. It's a simple little story, sure, but it's great. A chance to take part in the lives of the people in your divine care that plays out through a miniature sprite drama and feeds back into the gameplay loop. It's the incidental little moments like this that help smooth over ActRaiser's rough patches. The way these minor moments humanize the world you're creating makes it something far more endearing than the detached of the other Sims we've seen so far. What ActRaiser lacks in depth or breadth, it makes up for with heart, and that counts for a lot. When Hashimoto and Miyazaki broke away from Falcom, they brought with them composer Yuzo Koshiro, who composed one of his very few Super NES scores for this game. It is, hands down, one of the absolute greatest soundtracks ever produced for Super NES, or indeed for any system. Admittedly, it rips off John Williams' Star Wars score with zero shame, but what a ripoff. Actually, it's fitting that it borrows so much from the music of Star Wars because, as with Star Wars, the music here helps elevate good scenes into memorable masterpieces. Koshiro really put the sample-based audio format of the Super NES sound chip to great use here. The music has an orchestral sound quality to it that you normally only found in CD-ROM games of the era. From the soaring French horns of the title screen to the manic tune percussion and staccato horns of the Bloodpool action sequences, Koshiro defined what a video game soundtrack could be. Indeed, Final Fantasy II's excellent score, which we'll explore a few episodes from now, owes much of its quality to ActRaiser. Square composer Nobuo Uematsu was so amazed by Koshiro's compositions that he went back and reworked the Final Fantasy soundtrack to be more competitive with his peers' creation. And more than 25 years later, ActRaiser as a whole itself remains peerless. We've seen other games that explore some of the concepts and themes here, such as Level 5's Dark Cloud series and Dragon Quest Builders, but no one has ever quite recaptured ActRaiser's unusual blend of action, narrative-driven simulation, and soaring music. Enix of America insisted ActRaiser 2 drop the sim elements, and Quintet splintered and vanished nearly 20 years ago under somewhat mysterious circumstances. So I can't imagine that we'll ever see another game that quite matches ActRaiser on its own terms. And maybe that's okay. The existence of singular works like this help reinforce the value of vintage games. Why play Super NES in the year of our Lord 2018? Because no other game in 2018 allows you to assume the role of our Lord in quite the same way that ActRaiser did back in 1991. Really, the only bad thing about the original ActRaiser is that Square Enix hasn't been better about keeping it in circulation. Now that the Wii eShop and Virtual Console have been sealed like a particularly troublesome demon's lair, it's down to either ancient cartridges or piracy. But however you play it, ActRaiser's one-of-a-kind design deserves to be experienced by everyone at least once. It's a true Super NES masterpiece, and the first third-party release for the system to speak to what would make this console so beloved by so many. Anyway, next episode, it's back to the grind with some more sports.